Howdy there, friends. It is Glenn with the almost world famous Cactus Atlas, and today I find myself here at Dragoon, Arizona. We're about to go seek out some real Old West history out here in the desert. I decided to film in the truck for this one, at least the approach to where we're going, which we're going to go in depth. There's a lot of story to tell related to this, but if we take ourselves back to the 1800s, we're going to be smack dab in the middle of Apache territory, specifically the lands of Cochise. So far you can see for yourself this is a easy road, and hopefully there's no surprises or anything where I can't proceed, because that would suck. Like this gate up here, we'll have to see what this is all about, if it's public lands or not. I consulted my maps, but this is indeed Arizona State Trust land, which I didn't know what else it could be. I know there's like various tribes in Arizona have trust lands also, like Hopi trust land. We're not anywhere near that. But I wanted to just make sure, and I'll explain what this all means and demystify it, but let me go close the gate before I do. Okay, so we have the gate closed behind us, so cattle won't roam out. And let me explain what this is all about. So basically, Arizona State Trust land is basically, you just need a permit for it, and you can get them online. It's just a few bucks too a year. It's really super cheap. The money, I think, goes to funding public schools and things like that, so it's for a good purpose. But the end game is that you just need to bring like your permit. Well, I'm covering up my number because I don't know if that could be used against me, but you just print it out on your printer. That's all it is. You'll see land parcels sometimes intermixed and with BLM and all that kind of stuff. So to me in Arizona, it's just easier to have it than not have it. And I'm purposely saving the story time for when we get there out on foot. So I know I've been very vague about where we're going, other than it being a really cool remnant of 1800s settlement, and this starts going back really far. Probably the beginning of our story is going to be sometime around the 1850s, if you can believe that. If you've been with us on this channel for a long time, you would also know that, when you're out here looking for stuff, like things that go back that far are actually pretty rare to find, or any leftovers at all. Now, I don't think you're going to see any wood today. You're going to just see rock walls, things like that, but there's so much for us to unpack and interpret here, and here we go. So we want to go this way. Stage Station, look at that, they even put a sign for us on this. A little bit of a rockier road, but still easy. I'm still in two-wheel drive. I've not felt any need at all for four-wheel drive on this. So I would say so far, other than like a little bit of bumpiness here, you're probably fine. Now I'm going to start dropping hints. Now, we're coming out here to look at basically a station on an old stagecoach line that serviced different companies, like the Cactus Mail early on, all the way to like the Butterfield stage. Services that were designed to transit people and goods very quickly across the United States, which was becoming increasingly popular post, the famous year of 1849, when gold was found out west and you have settlement just starting to flood the area. And this is one area that back then was pretty sparse still, and if we're talking about the 1850s, it was still Mexico up until about 1853. where we're at. There's so many cool facts about this thing that I am looking forward to sharing here. But anyway, what beautiful area this is. So let me start with this. There's a really important strategic reason why this is here, as you'll find with many of these places out here, and that's because out in these hills, somewhere in the vicinity of this station we're gonna go see, was a spring. And as you're gonna learn, water is absolutely essential for the operation of this thing, as it was absolutely essential for people like the Apache, like Cochise' tribe. I think was he the Chokonan or the Chiricahua Apache? Now I'm forgetting some things, but needless to say, Cochise is very famous. You know the name. And I think if these are the Dragoon Mountains, like deep in there, there's like lots of big granite mazes and things like that. And that area is generally known as the Cochise stronghold because the Apache were able to survive out here so long by using that as a defensive
In 600 feet, you will arrive at your destination.
thing. And now I'm kind of looking here to see, there's a brown sign up here. Now there's like either a trail or there's gonna be some 2-track where I could drive right up on this thing. So either way, we're right on it. As long as I don't have to bushwhack, I'll be happy. But what do we got here? Stage, what does that say there? That says Dragoon Spring is gonna be off that way, okay? And then the station is straight ahead this way. So I'm gonna guess we park out here. Let me see if I can find a little place to pull off the road in case someone else comes out here. The spring we're actually not gonna go seek out. I didn't really do any research on that, but this is probably as good as it's gonna be. That thing should be out, right out that ways. And I'm guessing we're gonna have to take a foot trail, and I might see a foot trail, so not a big deal. We're gonna switch and get our hand-mounted cameras going, the drone today, and we're gonna do this. I might actually do the drone first and see if we could get some good footage. All right, I'm on foot now, and you can see looking this way at the landscape, there's some features that I'm going to be referring to. There's actually a hand-drawn sketch that someone made of here that was really essential, I think, in backing up a few various things. But one of the features that you'll see prominently on his sketch, albeit it is compressed, so the landscape, it's a perspective drawing. It looks a little bit thinner than it actually is like kind of in the middle. There's like a triangular feature in the middle of that little valley or canyon. I've heard to that referred to as like a shark fin shape. That's a prominent thing that you're gonna see in this sketch, and I'm gonna try to line it up when we get up there, but I wanted to point that out first. And essentially somewhere a mile from this approximate location is the actual spring. So I'm gonna guess, so there's a road that keeps going and it looks like it turns in there. So the spring's gonna be probably somewhere deeper in there where the actual water was. So I presume the way it worked they would transport water from there, about a mile over here where it was actually needed. Didn't read anything about that specific detail, but that would only make sense. And here we are at Dragoon Springs Station, by the way. That's the name of the thing I brought you out to see, established in 1858 in the heart of Apache country. The westernmost stone-fortified station on the Butterfield Overland Mail route, stage stop, used until 1862. The next stop beyond that was something called Ewell's, and the Dragoon Mountains' next stop west was the San Pedro River. And look at this big collared lizard just hanging out here. I'm not gonna bother you, but you're too beautiful not to film. I assume, I was thinking, are you alive? And there's your answer. He ain't no fool, but he's also on this side. Are we gonna play hide and seek? Oh, he probably climbed down the pole and ran away. So the arrow points this way. And I think we're just at most a couple hundred feet or something. We're not like going on some really insanely long hike, I don't think, here. So I'm not too worried, but I'm gonna take you all the way up to it so we can see this together And what we're looking for are just basically some walls and some graves. I see a fence up there with a sign on it, so I wonder if it's beyond that, kind of fenced in and protected. But I do want to remark on something that I'm feeling right now, that the people out here probably felt somewhat, is that, we are pretty far away from anything. The town of Dragoon's not horribly far. I could probably walk to it if I got in dire straits, but still, it's just me in this desert here, and these mountains and the bugs and the sounds. And I imagine it pretty much looked and felt just like this, looking at the landscape and trying to not get any of the road, any of my truck in the picture, which I think he is. Maybe we're seeing things exactly how it would have been seen through the eyes of not only the settlers coming out here, those working the stage lines, but the Apache also, and Cochise himself probably would have gazed upon this exact scene. Because that's one of the things about the story that knowing the struggle between the US and the Apache struggle with other countries like Mexico, and then the Spaniards before that. They were holding their ground out here for centuries. And unfortunately for them, this westward expansion was going to overwhelm them eventually. But at the time this thing was going on, they were still in a position of power and control out here, I would argue, and very much a danger to anybody traversing this landscape back then. I think I actually see the wall. Can you guys see the rock wall yet? Kind of peeking up. I'm going to help you interpret this. And I'll describe it as it once looked. Maybe we can even try to use the assistance of AI, the evil AI, to see if it can help us reimagine what it might have looked like. And I think there's some of the graves that I'm going to tell you about. At least one grave. There's actually, I think, a total of 7 people buried here from 2 different incidents, including Confederate soldiers. Yes, I said that. That is a fact. There's an interpretive sign or a couple signs here, but here it is, folks. The actual station. Wow. The walls are much higher than I was thinking. Yeah, Dragoon Springs Stagecoach Stop. So what you're looking at here is what's known as a swing station. What its purpose wasn't to accommodate hungry and thirsty travelers. There were types of stations that did that sort of thing. This was more for when they came through to swap out animals, like mules, for example, that were pulling the stagecoaches and wagons that came through here. So imagine, today we have electric vehicles, for example, and you're going to stop and hit a charging station. Maybe think of this as the charging station for animals, where you would swap them out with the fresh ones to kind of keep the tidy schedule, right? So they would be dropped off and held in a corral in here in this stone structure, and then swapped out for others. Then those other ones would be fed and watered, and then awaiting the arrival of another stagecoach to then swap them out, and so on and so forth. So that was the function of this. But it was also a pretty heavily fortified station. I think the walls were upwards of like 8 feet tall in its prime. I think there was a gate here, a large wooden gate, where we're going to walk through there. And the way it's described, and we can kind of reference the sketch that was drawn in the 1800s that I was talking about, because we are oriented, I think, facing the same general direction of that sketch. You could see that shark fin in the background. Basically, what you got going on was that most of this was probably open air, like this side here. And that's where the animals typically were kept. And then on this side, about a third of it going this way would have had a couple interesting features. One that probably would have been, I think there were like maybe 2 to 3 rooms with a thatched roof. So imagine like a skinny partition here that basically had storage space. They probably kept feed for the people living here and other supplies and probably stuff for the animals in there. It was also used as sleeping quarters, as you're going to know. And one of the rooms, I think, was the station master's room. So there's probably one permanent person here, but usually I think there were several humans out here living. But essentially, that was that. And I think there was a flag staff on the floor, like to mount a flag right outside this side. So if we could imagine it back in the day, you know, with those rooms there, the thatched roof, you'd also see a version of the American flag, most likely, you know, standing up from the structure at times, probably depending on when, because I know this was also considered part of the Confederate states. They laid claim to this area during the Civil War, so I don't know if it ever flew a Confederate flag here or if it was always a US flag, but that's basically a good way to kind of think about this, and maybe we can even reimagine it a bit. It's kind of interesting to think, you know, I do visit a lot of old Native American ruins, and usually all that's left, like Hohokam ruins, this is pretty much the same engineering that the Hohokam and tribes like that were using. They would create big rock walls, and any of the, you know, roofing, the wood, most of the time is long gone like it is here. But you will still see well-defined structures like this that people even centuries before these people arrived were constructing, but it almost reminds me of something like that. It's remarkable how much wall is actually left standing. They're a lot higher than I thought. So let's head on in here. Look, this is where I get nervous. You always got to be wary of snakes in these regions, but here we are inside of the actual station. So we're on this side, I guess the western facing side, which I believe would be your corral. So we're standing what I picture to be, it's the bulk of the square footage of this. You can actually see like these inner walls here that partition off rooms. One of them would have been like a small, this one I think was storage and sometimes serviced people sleeping. This may have been the station master's room on this side. And then kind of in the middle, somewhere here, I think the flag staff was here where they mounted like a pole and then the flag. But imagine this side, like I said, the walls would have been higher, and then you would have had a thatched roof like on this third. And it is about a third, just like I read. If I were to estimate that, it's about a third of the way through. It's really quite amazing. So when you hear the stories I'm about to tell you, we've got murder and mayhem to talk about. It always makes for a colorful, interesting story, I guess, that people enjoy. So people died in here, in this actual space that I'm walking in right now. So that kind of makes it eerie. In fact, they were likely killed, I'm guessing, in their sleep, or the violence started around then when there were 4 men stationed here during something that happened. This one is in 1858. So I'm going to tell you about that one first. Then we'll talk about the Confederate soldiers that are buried over on that other side and where they died, which wasn't in this structure, but it was, I think, nearby. Before we get into all that, though, I kind of wanted to step up into this room that I think is the station master's room. So it's either the station master or station master plus storage, or just maybe all of these were mainly storage and they had a little spot for people to hang out and sleep and stay out of the sun. Because if you haven't noticed, the sun is pretty brutal out here. And I'm doubtful they had like a door. Maybe they had a door that opened and closed here. I know there was a big wooden gate, because this was a somewhat of a defensive kind of fort-like structure, but I presume the exit way out of this room would have been here, and then you would have come out and you would have seen and probably heard, you had mules, I assume maybe horses, I don't know if it was mainly just mules, but you'd hear the sounds of animals right out here. You'd smell the smell of animals being kept in here for safekeeping. And then this area I don't think was a partitioned off room, but it would have been under the thatched roof. And here in the center, if I am not mistaken, also used for cover and for sleeping on that fateful night that we're going to talk about. And we'll come over here and look at this last one, which should have been the other storage room. You could see the walls really collapsed in on this side here. But essentially that was all there was to this. Not complicated. It got the job done. But boy, it would have been, I imagine, quite a lonely and boring existence at times. And then at other times, frightening, you know, when you know you've got, you know, very angry, unhappy natives roaming these mountains up here, not too happy about the presence of people out here and the increasing traffic. You'd always have to be vigilant. And you'd probably be keeping your eyes up on the ridge tops up there, looking for signs of natives looking down, maybe planning their move. All right, let's get into that more gruesome history here, and we're going to talk about the first one, which is the murder. There were actually 4 men out here, 4 station workers plus 3 Mexicans, and it sounds like the Mexicans were hired to do some kind of labor for people here at the station. So technically 7 men. A lot of the other people that were stationed here were off doing other tasks, and they had left here like in recent days before the bad thing actually went down. So the date was September 9th, 1858, and 4 men were here out in addition to the Mexican laborers. Their names were Silas St. John, James Burr, William Cunningham, and James Lang. So those are the 4 who were attacked by the 3 Mexicans. So on that fateful evening around midnight is when the crime actually happened. So we do have some information about where some of the men were sleeping that night. Silas St. John took this room, the one that I surmised might be the station master's room. It was a 9x10 room, kind of mirrors this other 9x10 room on this side. But the first victim, Silas St. John, was in the first room. The second person that had a room was Mr. Cunningham. He was in this other room, also a 9x10 room. So I'm guessing this mirrored this. And they both, you know, this one, for example, the drawing I see mentions this had some storage capability to it. So, you know, probably using storage rooms also as a sleeping quarters. But Mr. Cunningham was in this room. And then Mr. Lang was kind of in the middle here. Not really in, I guess this would have been under the roof, but he was sleeping in this area. So you had the 3 people here. And then the last one, Burr, on the drawing, it almost makes it look, it said Burr slept here. And it was on this wall. It makes it look like it might have been, all the names are outside of the structure. So it would have been weird for somebody to sleep outside on this wall. So I'm gonna guess Burr was, I don't know if he was out in open air with the animals or whatever, but the drawing I see shows him taking up residence here on this outside of the wall. And as for where the Mexicans were sleeping, I have no info on that, so I don't know if that's really a known thing. Now, we did have one survivor here, Mr. St. John Silas, so we'll get to that in a minute. So there are real accounts, right? Real descriptions of what happened here. So this isn't really surmising, but I did read just now, I was re-reviewing some information, said that James Burr was sleeping over here, and he might have been outside because they actually found his body outside the gate. I'm wondering if it's in this vicinity right here. And it was basically described that they found him, with half of his head bashed in, like probably by like a stone hammer or something like that, just to give you an idea of the violence here. So, and I think he may have been still somewhat conscious. Not everybody died immediately, but you're days away from any doctor getting out here, as we'll find out in a second. So basically, Burr, Lang, and Cunningham are all died. So there's 3 people buried here across 2 graves, and then 1 arm buried in between the graves. Yes, I did say arm, and that would be the arm of this guy, Silas St. John. And it's not funny, but I just kind of get overwhelmed thinking about I'm standing on the ground where this violence actually happened, and it's just kind of weird. So long story short, Silas St. John had a really bad wounded arm, and I think, all the men were out here, people came out, they discovered them, they went to go get water. St. John lives, but by the time a doctor got out here, I think 6 days later, they had to amputate. I mean, this is the 1850s, so they had to amputate it at the socket. So his arm, I don't know if it was the left or right arm, forgive me, but pretty much I think my interpretation is amputated his arm at the shoulder socket completely. And miraculously, even for being out here, keep in mind, let's look at this terrain again. Let's understand where we're at. That guy recovered, and he recovered very well and very quickly, so that I want to say within days to a couple weeks, he was well enough to actually get on horseback and get himself out of here. So that would be the first massacre of 1858. To make a point, not done by the Apache. This would have just been Mexican laborers, and they were here to steal the cattle, which I believe they got off with all of the cattle, or I should say mules and other beasts of burden that may have been stored in here. So that was their motive, was theft. So what I'm struggling with here is I'm trying to find the 2 graves where there's actually 3 people buried in 2 graves. Well, I'll explain that in a minute. And I'm trying to use that sketch that's on Wikipedia that was done because it shows 2 graves in the foreground, and they talk about that. And it's like what you want to do is line up the shark fin with the gate. And I'm doing that, and you would expect to see the graves. It says north of the wall, and this is all overgrown. I see nothing here, so I don't know if they were moved. I do see some graves over there that we're going to go look at. So this is a little bit more difficult than I thought. There's an interesting big rock out here, just randomly placed there. But, I think I'm lined up correctly, pretty close to where that sketch would have been made, using that perspective and lining things up as he said, and I do not see anything yet. I'm gonna kind of wander around here in this overgrown area. There's some cleared spots, so maybe there is something of note to see. I mean, once again, you have 2 large rocks in the general vicinity of where I was expecting to find the graves. So I'm a little baffled here for the moment, but that's okay. Those, I definitely use the interpretive sign over there to validate that those are the Confederate graves. But coming out this ways, I still don't see anything here. So I'm gonna go look at where we clearly see some rock piles and graves, and we're gonna just assume it's those over there. Once again, I'm gonna scan this general area where I was expecting to find the first 2 graves, and although, like I said, there's random rocks spread around. Nothing to me fits what I'm looking for. Unless unless those two big rocks out there represent the location. Because like I said, there would have been two. Let's just go back and I'll kind of explain the configuration, then we'll go compare it to what we're gonna see over there and I'll explain. I mean, these right here, that rock and that rock are kind of in the same vicinity of where I was expecting to place based on the perspective, the first two graves, based on my interpretation. So let's pretend for a moment these are the two graves where three people are buried in an arm. One of the graves has two bodies in it. The other grave has the third body in it. And in between the two, they buried Silas's arm after the amputation. So his arm might actually, if these are the original spots, it's just so curious how there are two stones in the location where I was expecting to see graves and a space in between them. So there might be a human arm buried right under here along with three bodies. But what's more curious to me is when we come in here and we were first walking in, I made note of another grave and I do see something else over here, which to me, these would be the better candidates for what we're looking for. But now the problem is if I'm interpreting that hand-drawn sketch correctly, this doesn't exactly fit, like with the position of them all. I guess you could say it's north of the wall technically, but let's see if I could find anything here. Clearly people, this is clearly a well-marked spot, probably a better candidate for what we're looking for. And all it says is US. I don't know if there were other deaths out here at any other time outside of those two events, but I wouldn't be surprised if these are the things we're looking for. We know they're not Confederate in nature, so maybe this is the double grave. It's pretty large. And then I do see like an interesting pile of rocks over here that might be a candidate for like an old pile of rocks that they would put over graves to help protect from animals. But I wasn't expecting to have as hard of a time IDing those, but let's pretend this is where those guys are buried. I don't know the exact configuration now because it's not clear as the Confederates are of which ones are individual graves, if there's actually three people buried here and an arm. But you're looking at this, so this is another contender, I would say. Let's stop here for a second. It appears that I interpreted this drawing much like many do, that with the gate facing the viewer, the graves must be to the north. What I didn't know at the time is that the artist appears to have used a composite or collapsed perspective, combining multiple viewpoints to show more of the station than would be visible from a single vantage point, a technique commonly used in that period of time. The key piece is Silas St. John's own words.
At the northwest corner, about 50 feet west from that point, are 4 stone-covered graves. The largest is a double grave in which rests together the remains of William Cunningham and James Hughes Burr. The single grave next south is that of James Lang. The double grave and the single one to the south of them are without markers. My good left arm was buried between those graves.
50 feet from that corner would put us by these. The larger one would indeed be the double grave of Cunningham and Burr, the first two who passed away. Lying while badly injured, clung to life but passed the day after discovery. He was buried in the smaller grave under the strewn rocks at the time of my visit. St. John's arm is between the two, likely below the earth I walk back and forth across. All right, let's now go look at the obvious ones. These are easier, much easier to figure out than the first two. And maybe we'll get lucky and see something more definitive as we explore back here. So we got to put ourselves into the context now of history, so this makes a little bit more sense, because it might be weird to hear that there are Confederate soldiers buried here, and sure enough, You actually see CSA on all of these graves, Confederate States of America. And there's another marker here, Confederate States of America. So what the heck were they doing all back here? Now the date that this all went down, by the way, was I think May 5th of 1862. So that overlays right on top of like the Civil War years, right? So what they were doing out here is the Confederacy made claim to this section of Arizona. So technically, I guess one could say this was contested. It wasn't always just between, you know, the US versus the Apache. You also had the Union versus the Confederates happening all the way out here. But ironically, these fellas didn't die by the hand of any Union soldiers. But that's essentially what they were doing out here, where back in the Civil War, it was very important to gain extra territory out in the Southwest, and the Confederates were trying to get their foothold. I also read, though, that I believe these 4 people, Confederates, one was actually a Mexican boy. I'll explain that in a minute, but these soldiers, I believe, were the westernmost deaths of any official Confederate soldier during the whole Civil War. I think they shed their blood further out west than any of their brethren did back home. So that's another interesting fact that we should consider here. So what essentially happened was you had a detachment of Confederate soldiers. The action actually went down about a mile out that way towards the spring. So if we went and found the spring, I assume the actual battle took place in that nearby vicinity about a mile away. So I'm assuming they were just brought to this, you know, this fortification, you know, for burial and for everybody to regroup after that, which I believe is known as the First Battle of Dragoon Springs. I think there were 2 battles over time, but interestingly, it was the Confederate soldiers, not the Union soldiers that you in blue that you typically associate with like cavalrymen and other soldiers fighting the Apache out here. This would have been something a little bit different, which makes this even more fascinating to me, and maybe some of the best history I've come across in the channel to date. The Confederates buried here, you'll actually see an article that refers to them as the Texans, because I guess they were from Texas, and it mentions 3 of them. It says the 3 Texans that died here. So one account doesn't even acknowledge the 4th one that died, which was a younger Mexican boy who, because of poverty, was kind of forced into service for the Confederacy. Probably, like, I don't know what the function of the Mexican boy was, but he is one of these 4 actually buried out here. So imagine that kid's fate, you know, being picked up in Texas by Confederate soldiers to help with their cause, coming way out here and then meeting his end at the hand of Apache. And just as with the first altercation, in this case, I'm assuming it took place up the way, but the Apache did defeat and murder some of these, and then these soldiers they stole their cattle or their horses, their mules, etc. Also, just like as the Mexicans stole the beast of burden from the first murder. So that was also a commonality between the 2 things. But yeah, somewhere up there, likely the Cochise and his warriors that lived in these mountains and hid out here were likely culprits, I believe, if not known culprits. Now, an unfortunate part of this story is one of the names of the gentleman out here, his last name was Ford. And in the 1960s, one of these graves, we'll see if there's any markers on it to say who's who. I did see one name on one of them, but one of these was dug up, basically, and they dug up everything in it, bones and all, assuming there were bones left. So an apparent grave robbery in the 1960s, and there's actually an article from the Forest Service about it, so it definitely happened. So one of these graves, we presume, does not have any remains in it anymore. That's, I don't know why, that's just a shame. Even in the 1960s, people should have known better, but people were trying to find treasures. That's not that uncommon of a situation. I did find info that the Mexican boy's name was Ricardo. And here's another thing Oh, S. Ford. So 1862. So there's a marker. I don't know how old that marker is, but if I'm correct, this is the one that was dug up. So this would have been, I believe, one of the shoulder, can't talk. I believe this would have been one of the soldiers, S. Ford. As we know, Ricardo starts with an R, and that's not on this grave, but I also don't see any information that distinguishes the names of the remaining ones. But I'm gonna go read the interpretive sign and see if we left out any important tidbits here. So I got most of it right, I would say. I got all of it right, but I guess the way this interprets it is what was going on. I think the station was actually abandoned in 1862, but nonetheless, this detachment had a bunch of cattle, and they were trying to round up the cattle in this general vicinity, I think out towards the spring probably, where they met the Apache. So that kind of explains that part of the story. And then towards the end, it just mentions Samuel Ford. We identified his grave, and Ricardo, a Hispanic cattle drover. So that would be the Mexican boy that I mentioned. There are no markers on the other two mounds, but one is thought to be the remains of a Captain John Donaldson, and then the fourth, this sign claims, is unknown. So let's see if we could find the marker for Ricardo so we could at least identify his grave. And here it is. You can actually make out the words, I think, Ricardo, and then a cross on that stone. I don't know how old that is, if that was done at the time of the burial or done in a later time, but it's very faded. I had seen a picture of that. So there you go. So Ricardo, the Mexican cattle hand, young boy is my understanding, and then S. Ford, the one that I believe was dug up. And then I don't know then which one would be Donaldson. There are no markers, or the unknown grave, but it's the two on the outer periphery that would represent the unknown one, and then Donaldson. And there you have that part of the history. I mean, there's definitely a lot to talk about with all this stuff, and I've recently started studying the Apache Wars. So in 1862, when they came out here, this was after what's known as the Bascom Affair, where Cochise was actually mistakenly accused of a kidnapping, and then the U.S. Army seized him near Apache Pass. He escapes by slicing through a tent and gets away. And then that event was really critical, I think, in relations between the U.S. and the Apache going south very quickly, and really, I think, is looked at as initiating what's known as the Apache Wars. So all throughout this land for decades, you had fighting and killing, and the Apache, like I said, it wasn't just the U.S. Before that. They were fighting off the Mexicans and trying to hold back the Spanish, and they did a great job all the way up until the late 1800s, where unfortunately they were just overrun. There was just too many people flooding out here. So that's really what did that in. But very fascinating, though, to know that that event that we just talked about was just a couple years after the Bascom Affair. I think just the year after. This was May 5th of 1862. And I want to say Bascom is 1861, if I'm not wrong. Forgive me if I misquote something, but something like that. So it's just amazing to think of that. Well, my friends, I think that's going to tidy this one up here at Dragoon Springs Station. Some fascinating Old West history, if I've ever heard it. So if you like this video, of course, do all the YouTube things, the like, share, subscribe, you know the drill. But if you want to help fuel future explorations like this on our channel, we do have a Buy Me a Coffee site where you can donate any amount that you wish to help fuel future episodes of the Cactus Atlas, so I can bring you out to more locations like this. My truck Slim has got a big appetite for gas, and gas is expensive these days. Anyway, anything helps, but at the very least, continue watching our stuff and tell a friend, and that does wonders. So consider one of those options. And let's take in one last look to such a historic pile of rocks out here on the northern side of the Dragoons, the land of Cochise. See you on the next adventure, friends. Bye-bye.